Thank you very much for having us here. My name is Kathleen Ryan.
My name is David Staton. I'm from the University of Northern Colorado. And today we're going to talk about our project, Defining Done in Interactive Documentaries. Central to that title and central to what we want to talk about today is this idea of done or doneness. And you might be asking, what is done? It means a lot of different things in a lot of different places. If you, as we are bringing a car to a mechanic tomorrow, when he says it's done, it means something entirely different than when a chef takes a cake out of the oven and says, this is done. In creative practice and in the academy and the sorts of works that we do in interactive documentary and in larger digital humanities practice, what is done becomes a totally different question and equation. There's not great agreement. The academy and creative practice isn't a monolith, and there's been all sorts of applications and ideas that have tried to tease out this notion of doneness. If you think about music, to isolate one, there's this idea of a community of practice that drives the idea of doneness. Whereas if you were engaged in pedagogy, maybe that's the sort of thing that comes out of field work and theory and that sort of application. The revision and the reflection that becomes tied to disciplinary goals resulting in sort of a pedagogy, that might be an idea of doneness. In the business world, entirely different ballgame, and none of these are right or wrong. It just shows you this diversity. The business markers might be, hey, we met our sales goals, or hey, we got those deliverables on this calendar time, or we met these tasks. Drives us back to that central question again. So what is done in the area where Kathleen and I have presented projects? What is done? And I want to talk about what we have developed as some best practices. In oral history and interactive documentary, we believe that the assertion of an emphasis on these areas are the best practices. And those ideas include, of course, storytelling, the idea of many voices rather than one, the idea of shared authority, and giving the storyteller, in the case of the two projects Kathleen's going to describe in just a moment, women or people identifying as women, giving them the agency and the space and the room and their consent to contribute to and have their voice heard and seen or listened to. We also describe feminist practice as being fully engaged in this best practice idea of what is done. That shared authority that underscores feminist practice, underscores doneness and our best practice ideas. Audiences, we seed agency to audiences wherever and whenever audiences encounter our materials, whether that be in an iDoc or again in a digital humanities project, we accord them that space as a best practice that they make a meaning, which contributes sort of to this Gestalt idea of agency and contribution, and there not being a single takeaway in terms of meaning and definitions. So in the oral history world and interactive documentaries, what we've discovered is having the best practices incorporates these ideas, maybe not all of them, but some of them leads to this idea of doneness. And we've really focused particularly on all of these, but that idea of a diverse population of narrators being so very important in best practices. The idea also of informed consent. People giving consent to allow us to shape, to some degree, their stories, but not until they are finally done with it, not until they've exerted their agency, and then we shape that. Also, we've committed our idea of best practices to include making those stories available. The whole idea of a story is its desire to be heard, and we think best practices have to incorporate this idea of making public access available, either archival or in other readily available platforms. And I would add here also making those free. But what happens though when you bump into best practices and ideas and ideals about doneness? those might be limited by some budget or bandwidth or space, but often technology bumps into that. And then how do you get to that spot where, with this vast raw material that you have, and in our case we had hundreds of hours of talking and speaking with people and having them share their stories, when do we just stop playing around with it? When do we stop tinkering? I'm going to let Kathleen describe these projects for you.
Thanks, David. So the first project that we're going to talk about here is Homefront Heroines, The Waves of World War II, and this is an NEH-funded project from the National Endowment for the Humanities here in the United States, for those of you who don't know the acronym NEH. And so part of what NEH asks for is that these projects have as long of a lifespan as possible. And so to do this, what we decided on this particular project was to build it using WordPress. So WordPress is an open, is one of the most popular content management systems in the world. It has many, many free themes, and these themes are various templates that you can use. That's what they call the templates. It's like these themes, and they have different ideas that you can use, or different ways that they present content. And so what we decided to do, we didn't feel that the free themes actually had the robustness that we were looking for, so we decided to go with a paid theme. NEH funding enabled us to do that, called 𝗖𝗍, which I think cost like $100, $200 for a lifetime license. It was fairly affordable. But one of the things that we really liked about it was that it had these interactive elements that were directly built into the platform. You could do these interactive elements in other WordPress themes, but it would require coding knowledge, which we didn't really have. And so this let us do something very easily to say, oh, I want you to click on an image and something to happen. It let us do that. Or it'll say, I want to engage in parallax scrolling, which is where you see the background image move at a different speed than the page itself. It allows you to do that without having to do coding. So for us, that was a really great thing that we wanted to have in this project, and this theme gave us access to that without having to worry about bringing in, say, someone from the technology side of things. It also, WordPress is integrated with something known as the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer, or rather OHMS, integrates nicely with WordPress. OHMS is open source, and it allows you, it's a way that you can put the oral history interviews into a site and allow them to be searchable. And you can look at the oral and jump to any part and listen to it. And so we knew that we wanted to use this for the interviews, and since it natively it and WordPress talk to each other really nicely, so for us, that made WordPress a logical choice. And then finally, just in this project itself, the storytelling is relatively linear. So this is a little bit different than some other interactive documentaries in that we are expecting people to go, or not expecting rather, but the story kind of goes from the beginning of war to the end of the war. It's about World War II, so it starts prior to the war's breaking out, and then and then it eventually ends up with the women's lives after the war. And so you could kind of follow it through that way. It's not something that's very as exploratory as some other projects, the next project that we're going to talk about that we've worked on. So in co-creation, this became a little bit tricky in this project because the narrators did read and edit their oral history transcripts, but due to their age, they really couldn't edit their iDoc stories. When we started doing the interviews, the youngest one was 80 years old, and most of them were much older. And when a decade later we start working on the interactive documentary, many of them unfortunately had died, and so they couldn't participate in that part. Because David and I had been involved in this project for so long, though, we were able to really, take our conversations. We had participated in many, many interviews with these women, read their oral histories, been involved in the editing process, had dined with them in some cases, stayed at one of their homes at one point in time, and really used these sort of conversations and knowledge to really drive the story. So we were saying, we can't take it to them, but we're using all of our knowledge of our experience with them to really help with the story. And so here's an example of what the page looks like and the various pages look like. And what you see at the upper left is the landing page, and then you'll scroll down from there and you'll see various interactive elements that you can click on to get into different elements of the story. At the right-hand side, you see one of our pages. In this case, it's talking about the uniform design. There's a couple of call-out quotes by two of the women that were interviewed. And then you see smaller stories below it, and there's a little bit of information, and then those photographs you can click on, and they flip around, and they go to a video. The videos are hosted externally. They're not natively embedded in the site, which we feel is is sort of a negative for 𝗖𝗍 and for WordPress. And then finally at the bottom, what you see is the oral history interview itself. And as I say, if you click on one of those time codes, it'll jump to that point in the interview, and then you can listen to it. So what are the other downsides? I mentioned, the video isn't natively embedded. We're hosting it on Vimeo, on a Vimeo Pro channel. So that's kind of a problem, but that's a minor problem. There were two sort of larger issues that we had that are challenges to done this. The first is, because WordPress is so popular, it's also it's popular to get hacked. And so our site has been hacked and we had a ransomware attempt. We were able to get past it, but that was something that was definitely we had to go in and completely, rework the site, pull everything down, reload the site from our backup files, which is doable. But it was just something that we didn't necessarily expect having to do once the project was completed or done. The other issue, and it's something that's ongoing right now, is that 𝗏s is currently operating in PHP 7.2, and we're at 8.3, I think, right now. So the PHP is outdated. That's the security code underlying it. And we need to update all of our 𝗏s files, and so that's going to take a little bit of time. And so right now we're paying to keep them active, but if we didn't have that sort of access, we might not. The project might end up disappearing and going away, which would be a challenge to it being actually ever done. The second project is Pin Up the Movie, an interactive documentary, and this is a project that was built in 𝗏𝗃𝗃. 𝗏𝗏𝗃 is a pay platform, and it was initially developed for the folks who developed 𝗏𝗏𝗃, the folks behind Prison Valley, which is one of the first, really kind of famous, got a lot of traction in terms of interactive documentaries. They now have this pay platform, that also has an educational license that you can work in and allows for interactive storytelling. So it's great because, again, it has that robustness, doesn't require the coding because they've built all of that stuff into the platform. In this particular project, it's very non-linear. I can't tell you what the exact story is because there isn't a specific one story that we're asking you to follow. It's but rather to understand a subculture, and this is a subculture of women who dress in vintage fashion. As a result, there's a high level of gamification. User actions cause things to happen and get you access to new content. And so that's something that we really leaned into very heavily here to keep that user engagement going on. There is, unfortunately, because 𝗏𝗏𝗃 is this sort of different sort of system and a pay platform isn't open source, there's no way to date to use something like 𝗏s with it. So the interviews themselves are not, full interviews are not living on this site, which we feel is a big detraction to doneness here. But this is what's going on in this particular project. In this case, our co-creation strategies were a little bit easier. First off, the narrators were all still alive, so we asked them to approve all the edited stories before publication. So we'd edit the story, we'd give it to them, and we'd say, after they reviewed their transcripts and made edits to their transcripts, we'd then do the editing, come back to them and say, this is what your story looks like, and they would say yay or nay in terms of that story. And if they asked for changes, we would accommodate them for the most part. There were a couple times where there were negotiations, but most of the time we were really just letting them, it's like, yeah, you can make the changes. One of the accommodations that we did make is there were some of our narrators that didn't want their voices to be used, specifically the trans pinups. They asked that their voices not be used. And then we had a couple of pinups that didn't speak English natively, and they didn't want, and so they were very uncomfortable. They did the interview in English, but they felt that they didn't sound as smooth as they wanted to. So in those cases, what we did is we developed a text and video, a text option for the stories that allowed those stories to kind of be shared and not call out certain people as being different. And we use that very consistently throughout the project. And again, this is what this project looks like. And you see here on the upper left, an example of one of the stories where we have the interviews of the women. And when you click on one of those images, it will flip over and either it will engage video play or it will engage a text where you're seeing the woman tell her story in text. On the bottom left, what you see is the boudoir. This is where everyone lands, and initially it's very clean. There aren't clothes on the floor. There aren't these random shopping bags or other, or things stuck up on in the mirror or littered over the sofa. As you play the story, more and more elements engage, and you see them appear. So you'll know that maybe, oh, I need to go back and revisit the ottoman, or the sofa that leads to a series of stories. And if you see something and you didn't click on it, it's like, oh, maybe I need to go back and click on that boa because there's going to be a story there. Another thing in co-creation that we engaged in was outside of the documentary itself, and this is on Instagram. And what we see, and this is what you see at the right-hand side of the screen. We gave certain pinups globally the ability to take over our platform, and in this case, this was Miss Sweetblack, who is a black pinup from France. She was living in French Guiana at the time. Then she did the takeover, and we let her take over our Instagram account for the month and share stories with people from all over the globe, which she did. She had these great women that she shared stories with, and we did this several times. And so this was a part of the way that we could keep that co-creation really active even after the documentary itself had been published on its webpage. So one of the detractions, I would say, for Raconteur, unlike WordPress, which is very easy to constantly update, we have our site already set to always be updating, so it has the most current standards going on, and if we do need to make changes, they're fairly easy to do because we can get into WordPress and the back end and make those changes. In Raconteur, because it's a paid system, you have to pay to download a code package which you then put for your site. So if any changes need to be made after that download, it's going to cost more money. And so we've kind of let that site just sort of live as it was when it was completed in 2021. But it could be subject to, like, say, the PHP issue that I mentioned previously, or other things that would require updating, and eventually this site could feasibly go away if we don't rejigger with it, or if Raconteur itself is a company that disappears. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to turn this back to David for a working definition of what is done.
So back to that initial question that we posed, what is done? These are the things that we think, if we can check these boxes, we're going to consider a project done. Both Kathleen and I teach ethics, so we really do walk the walk and talk the talk when it comes to implementing ethical standards when we're doing oral history. And that would include ideas of autonomy, sharing, allowing, and the idea of co-creation, in which agency is granted both the storyteller and the audience and the person who's kind of connecting those dots there. And the ideas of transparency also were underscored by ethical standards there. Of course, the idea of reflexivity, considering ourself in relationship to the story, and the storyteller's relationship in relationship to the story and history, and situating that person within certain constructs and certain contexts of the cultural conditions that were extant at the time when we were creating and sharing those stories. We also really think one of the markers for doneness is maybe the most important here, making those stories available. Those stories need to be heard and seen. They are stories that have been shared under these ethical conditions, under these ideas of reflexivity and agency and granting of consent. And so those are stories in search of an audience, and we've tried to do that at no cost in our digital humanities works and our interactive documentary works, and making sure that those stories, to the extent that we can at the time when they're done, have a space and a place to live and to breathe.
So with that being said, and we also obviously have this idea of audience having access and they're developing their own meaning in these sort of stories. We also want to recognize when we're talking about doneness that this is a working definition. And these things are things that we're kind of still evolving. We're trying to take a stab to say, what does done look like? But it may not be something that is always there or always available in, something that we may not be able to hit exactly, or we may say at some point, we need to add some things to this definition because it's not recognizing things that we haven't thought about yet. I'd like to thank you very much for your time, and as David pointed out, I forgot to mention earlier, I'm from the University of Colorado Boulder, and I want to make sure that get that in there. We thank you for your time here.
And thank you to IFM for making this a possibility to share our story with you.